So tonight it gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend Stanley Rapoport, who's also, of course, a member of our academy. Stanley has recently retired from a 52-year research career at the NIH, and tonight we're going to hear about a brief moment in March 1965 when, as a young United States Public Health Service officer, he went to Bogalusa, Louisiana, at the request of the Medical Committee on Human Rights. In Bogalusa, he reported that health facilities were out of compliance with Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and by happenstance, he became involved in local civil rights protests. Stanley?
Thank you very much, John. So this is going to be medical history, interacting with civil rights, and in a town named Bogalusa, which few of you have heard about and less have visited. Bogalusa is in northeast Louisiana, and a small paper mill town isolated from the general civil rights movement in the country. And there were a group of very courageous black people who decided to demand their civil rights and fight for them. Now, the medical part comes into the fact that I, in 1964, volunteered for the Medical Committee on Human Rights to go down and see whether Bogalusa was in the hospital in Bogalusa, supported by the federal government, was in compliance with the 1963 Supreme Court, Fourth Circuit Court decision against separate but equal and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, for me to go over this story is really going to depend on my recollection of the time. I kept notes when I was down there. I took photographs, and in preparation for this talk, I researched the web and looked at newspaper reports from 1965 just to bring the past into the present. So I just note that William Faulkner lived in Oxford, Mississippi, and talked about the fusion of the past and the present in our current life. And this really is a talk of having the past sort of inform my life and our lives at the present. It's also a talk about the fact that the medical situation, outcome situation in Bogalusa in 1965 and racial disparities that existed there still exist now. And so the past of racial disparities are still informing the present. Now, everything, medicine and civil rights come together in the history of separate but equal. You all know that the 14th Amendment established equal protection of the laws, and then the Plessy versus Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court established separate but equal and said they do not violate the 14th Amendment. In 1946, after the Second World War, money was invested by the federal government in construction of new hospitals under the Hill-Burton Act under the separate but equal clause. Separate but equal really meant separate and unequal. And in 1956, the NAACP started to litigate separate but equal. And the key decision was when a dentist and two doctors in Greensboro, North Carolina, sued the Cone Memorial Hospital, which had been federally supported, for not allowing them into the hospital and for denying black treatment there. And this decision is the key decision, which was cemented by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VI, which prohibited discrimination by race, color, and national origin in all federally assisted programs. But in many places in the South, there was noncompliance in 1964. And if you recall, President Johnson did not want to send federal officers down to assert noncompliance. It was not until 1966 that the situation became so dramatic that 300 public health servicers were sent down to enforce compliance. Well, in 1963, the Medical Committee of Human Rights was formed. It involved New York doctors, renowned New York doctors and Boston doctors, and to get involved in the issue of unfair medical care. And it provided, the first thing it did was provide medical assistance during the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream March. Then in 1964, it supported CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, going down to Jackson, Mississippi, to involved in voter registration. And in 1965, March 25th, it supported the Selma, Alabama March. The other thing the medical committee wanted to do for the courts and for their program was to document healthcare disparities in the South. My wife Judy and I returned from 2 years postdoctoral studies in Sweden. In the summer of 1964, we were fundamentally disconnected from what was happening in the country, and we attended a medical committee get-together in August in Washington, and they were looking for somebody with a medical degree to go down south and evaluate the hospital there and the medical care there. Judy volunteered. We had a 4-month-old child, and she said I'd have to take care of Eric, and I took the ticket, and I decided to go. Now, unfortunately, the medical committee was dissolved in 1980, yet the issues still remain, and one would say that we need a new medical committee for health care in this country. Now, this is my travel orders. I was a surgeon in the public health service at NIH, and I applied for travel permission in August of 1964, and it took me about 8 months after my application went up the ladder to the director of NIH for me to get permission to go down south. And you can see that my salary was $11,000 a year at that time, if you could see that. But I was asked to allowed to do purely medical research on the basis, medical survey on the basis of race and poverty in Louisiana. My agreement with my lab chief and the clinical scientific director was I would never mention that I was a federal officer or being in the public health service. And I agreed to that foolishly because I broke that immediately after I went down. The organizers of the medical committee are listed here. There is Paul Dudley White, a cardiac surgeon, Benjamin Spock, Albert St. Georgi, and Joseph Stokes, who had supervised my 1 month of public health course at Harvard. Now, I didn't know very much about the South. The furthest south I'd gone was across the Potomac into Alexandria. I was really a total northerner. And so I drew a picture of where Bogalusa is, and it's right over there. It's at the corner, it's just south of Jackson, Mississippi, south of Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the In June of 1964, the 3 students working for Corps had been murdered, Cheney, Schwerner, and this was a picture that I found in my notes, and it's about 100 miles north of New Orleans along Pontchartrain. Now, the history, I had to look up the history of Bogalusa. I'd never heard of it before, and it really was not a town where you had plantation mentality. It was a paper mill town founded in 1904 by the Goodyears. And it had the name means dark waters because before 1904, and in fact in the 1800s, the Choctaw lived there, and they were deported to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears by Andrew Jackson. So it has a sort of nefarious history. It also had a very powerful black and white union. And in 1919, when Bogalusa had the largest sawmill in the South, they both protested together. They did not fight, and they were sort of antagonized by the Klan. Now, Bogalusa in southern Mississippi was the site of the original Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1950s and 60s. And this was considered the most violent Klan in the country. There were more killings, lynchings, intimidation by the original Knights than in other Klan sites in the country. Now, in parallel to this, what was very impressive about Bogalusa was that in 1956, the black community formed a voters' league. Many of the people who formed the voters' league, many of the men, had come out of the army and simply wanted to assert their rights and fight for their liberty. And this was the time when the NAACP was banned in Louisiana. Now, the Klan was so violent and so intimidating that the Voters League broke up in '65 into the political arm and then an armed arm, a defensive arm, called the Deacons for Defense and Justice. Now, this was formed, this armed group, about a year before the Black Panthers were formed in Oakland. So it's the first armed resistance to the Klan. And because of this armed resistance, Martin Luther King would never come down to Bogalusa, and it was relatively ignored. Now, just before I came down, Bogalusa was not in the national newspapers, but I just took 2 articles out. One about a Corps member who was beaten, arm broken in town. Corps was trying to deal with voter registration. And in the history of Bogalusa, it appears that Charles Hicks' mother was the one with a gun who went out and fought the Klan, intimidated the Klan. The other important thing is that there was a white community in Bogalusa of leaders who really wanted to compromise on civil rights. There was Ralph Blumberg was the operator of a radio station, and one of the reverends in the St. Matthew's Church was Bruce Shepard, and these were very liberal people, all of whom were forced out by the Klan. The Klan was not simply attacking the black community, it was suppressing the moderate white community. Well, I flew into Bogalusa with my travel orders, was met at the New Orleans airport on one hot night and driven by a young Corps worker to 100 miles north in the night and dropped off at the Hicks house, where I was taken in and where armed members of the deacons sort of were surrounding the house, and I realized this was a serious business. And the following morning, and they were very generous to me and took enormous chance in having me there, but they were very active in the movement. The next day, my office was in the barber shop. The barber shop had a telephone. It had a taxi service run by a civil rights, somebody who turned out to be a civil rights leader. I mention names here because they deserve to be mentioned. And the names actually came back through my email exchange with Barbara Hicks when I asked her details. And then they had the secretary of the Voters League there who arranged for people from the Black African American community to come and describe their interaction with the healthcare system in Bogalusa. I just want to show some pictures. I was fortunate to take one roll of pictures. This was the housing that you saw in Bogalusa in much of the black neighborhood. Very poor, decrepit housing. Here are 4 children on a porch washing and looking at me. I was driven about by one of the taxi services from taxi drivers from A.Z. Young's taxi service. And this particular picture I found was really moving. You see a young man sitting on the porch of a house that really is decrepit and falling down. A large part of the black community was living in these places without houses, open sewers, and it was a deplorable sight. Now, I had come down to do my medical report, and I had experience with 1 month at Harvard in doing a medical report. I had spent 6 months or 8 months in the NIH library reading about Bogalusa and identifying names of doctors that I could contact and did contact. And one of the persons I contacted was the superintendent of Washington St. Tammany Charity Hospital. This hospital was built with Hilburton funds and therefore should have been desegregated, and I was to determine whether it would be or not. On the second day of my visit, I walked into the hospital. I had an appointment with the superintendent, Mr. Brown, and told him, I hadn't told him why I was coming, and told him I was a federal officer and really wanted to determine whether the hospital was in compliance. Within 10 minutes, a guard came into the room and escorted me out of the hospital. The next day, I went with a deacon back into the hospital and visited the emergency ward, the floors, and I really had armed protection because at that time I noticed that people I was in the white section of town, were actually following me as I was walking about, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So this is my report, and this is where the medical issue comes in. I wrote a report for the medical committee about segregated facilities in Bogalusa, and these are the details of my report. The hospital was a public hospital supported by Hilburton and was out of compliance. The waiting rooms on the first floor and wards on the second floor were either white or colored, but the signs were absent. The black ward was crowded and dirty and filled. The dental clinic required that it was white for Tuesday and colored for Thursday. The medical clinic was morning white and afternoon colored if all the whites had been seen. And I got some of this information from the community. The Bogalusa Community Center, all the floors were segregated. Admission listed black patients without their appellation of Mr. or Mrs. The Rest Haven Nursing Home was only white. The Dayport Clinic, only white. There was no black physician, nurse, or health administrator in the city, And the painful thing is that there was a school, a state school for practical nurses, but it was only white. And this is a letter regarding training of practical nurses in Bogalusa given to me by the medical committee. It was a letter from the executive secretary of the Louisiana State Board of Practical Nurses who had come up to Bogalusa to evaluate whether two, what they called our Negro girls, they actually were women who had raised families, the term girls, were interested in practical nurse education. Now, the meeting was with the Negro principal in Bogalusa, and he agreed with the superintendent of schools that the Washington St. Tammany Hospital could not accommodate two groups of practical nurses, and therefore that no black practical nurse could be trained in Bogalusa. I think one of the women was Gail Jenkins, and I don't know who the other woman was. Now, the net effect of separate but equal, as I thought it, as I reviewed it in the census, was that there were dramatic health outcome disparities in Louisiana. The maternal mortality was 3 times higher for non-whites. The neonatal mortality was 50% higher. Infant mortality was 2 times higher. And life expectancy was 6 to 8 years less. That is a dramatic difference. And I assumed, to a large extent, that this was one of the consequences, separate but equal. And I was doing research on muscle at NIH, on frog muscle. So this is where my medical intuition came back. These are the suggested causes of health outcome disparity that I wrote in a report to the medical committee: separate but unequal facilities, limited family planning, no black doctors, registered or practical nurses, public health staff, and then the social economic issues: lower income and education, higher unemployment, unsanitary living conditions, and poor nutrition. Well, I ultimately left Bogalusa. I'll tell you about what happened to delay my departure. But in August, I wrote the report in April '65, and in August '65, I got a letter from the executive director of the medical committee, which was very flattering. Your paper, known as the Rapoport study, has been used by MCHR volunteers who have gone into Louisiana during the summer. Much of the work, and this is what the committee was so impressive and represents such an arm of active physicians, much of the work has consisted of the organization of health associations, emergency first aid in areas of heavy civil rights demonstrations, evaluation of sanitation facilities in communities, examination of public health funded facilities, health education in rural areas, and conducting health examinations of summer volunteers. We are now called on to provide long-term care in Louisiana, a fact which you certainly recognized. Now, on the third day of my visit, after I'd visited the charity hospital on that third day, I was going to leave the following morning, driven to New Orleans, and Robert Hicks, Charles's father, invited me. He said, it's all finished, invited me with several other people into a bar to drink beer and relax. And as we were drinking the beer, the lights of a police car came on, and I was shocked as a physician that I was being arrested, taken into the car, taken to the local jail, and thrown into the jail cell, threatened by the detective. And at that point, I really broke my pledge to my bosses at NIH. I took out my military card and said, if anything happens to me, the FBI will be down here. And they almost believed me, I thought. So I'm sitting there with speeders, people who are getting rid of their alcohol inhibition to about 3 hours, and quite nervous. This was the first time I was in prison. And 3 o'clock in the morning, the policeman on duty, who was not the policeman who arrested me, said, "You're free to go." This was 3 in the morning. I said, "That's interesting. I'm glad about that." He said, "Just go out into the square and you'll find your way home." And I went out into the square, and then I realized this was serious. There were 2 cars with Mississippi license plate just across the Pearl River waiting for me with men in the cars, and you can see lit cigarettes. Fortunately, that policeman let me back into the prison, into the police station, and I called one of the men at the taxi service, and I found out that the reason I was left was that the black community had threatened the white owner of the Blue Room that if he didn't pay the $50 bail for me, they would burn the place down. And I realized this was serious. So I was taken into one of the cars, and then we started to drive all over Bogalusa with the Klan cars following us. And then I was deposited into the home of this man, Sam Barnes, and that's when I realized how existential the issue was for the black community. This is the point I really remember. I saw his wife essentially crying and sobbing and terrified to have a white person coming to their house. And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand her terror. We were all with armed people. And I just say that terror was justified, because I went back to Bogalusa 2 years later, and I found out from Barbara Hicks that Sam Barnes had been killed by the Klan 6 months later. This is really existential there. And the other person in this figure is somebody named Joel Rosenberg. He was a core worker who picked me up, and I found information about him. He had been vetted by Core psychologically and was a terribly courageous man to be down there. So I had nothing to do for the next few days until the lawyer from, Core lawyer from New Orleans would allow me to leave. I didn't want to leave. I'd be a fugitive. And I got involved in the first major march in Bogalusa on April 8th, 1965, before the courthouse. And this march shows 3 important people in the Bogalusa movement. One is A.Z. Young, who ran the taxi service. The other is Ronnie Moore, who's still alive. A.Z. Young, by the way, led a march from Bogalusa to Baton Rouge in 1967, a 110 march, protest march, and became very famous and worked in the governor's office finally. And this is James Farmer, who was the head of Congress of Racial Equality. Now this picture, my sister sent to me a couple of years ago. I was unaware that it existed. And the house where I was is called the Robert Hicks House. It's become in the National Park Service, and somebody had taken a picture of me with, it says, all of these men in this picture preparing for the march are deacons, excluding the white man. And Barbara Hicks told me, because I've really kept contact, Daddy must have trusted you if he let you in with the deacons. But this is Charles's father, and this is a very famous man, Charles Sims, who essentially was head of the armed movement, and very gruff, but very courageous. Now, After I wrote my report, they sent me the report, and I kept on in contact with the Corps Southern Director, who wrote me a letter in 1965 concerning the demands of the Negro community in that sick city. Bogalusa had just exploding. Everything was falling apart. They can best describe this wise. The Bogalusa Voters League has drawn up grievances against local public officials, the state of Louisiana, the local business community, and separately Crown Zellerbach. The key thing about Bogalusa was the black community was so forceful and so cohesive, and got finally involved with lawyers and people to really desegregate the whole community. Now, 2 years later, I was at a biophysics meeting at the NIH in New Orleans, and I decided to drive up and see how people were in Bogalusa simply because I so admired these people. A.Z. Young at that point had lost his taxi service. The bank had withdrawn the loans, and he no longer had a taxi service. And this is a picture of me in the bar. And I found out that I was remembered as the doctor who didn't finish his beer and came back to finish it. So these are three people: Fletcher Anderson, I, and Robert Hicks, Charles's father. Robert Hicks was the president of the Voters League and had sent his whole family into what we call the movement. And in 1967, after I visited, A.Z. Young and Robert Hicks came to Washington and actually met and worked with George Dreesen, who is here, as a lawyer, because they were suing the hospital, they were suing Crown Zellerbach, and they were suing the school system. And George Dreesen not only was up here, but he was down in New Orleans and had met the family. I took this picture simply to put the two men in front of the White House. I thought that would be appropriate, coming from this small town. And these are two men who tremendously courageous and changed the system for the better. Now, 50 years go by. I actually forgot about Bogalusa. I was doing my research at NIH, moving up the ladder, and it wasn't just read about it occasionally in the news. And this is the good part after 50 years. Fletcher Anderson and and my wife went down to Bogalusa, is still alive, and we took a picture of ourselves and in remembrance. He's one of the three deacons still alive. Now, this is the bad part, and this is where the past hasn't really changed. Louisiana health today, despite abolition of separate but equal in 1966, today Louisiana has the worst health care system in the country. Some of the highest infant, child, and maternal mortality rates, one of the lowest life expectancies. The other competing states are West Virginia and Mississippi. The other part is the health outcome disparities still remain. In 2015, you can see the maternal mortality rates are 3 times higher in the black community in Louisiana. Neonatal mortality 2 times higher, infant mortality 2 times higher, and there's still a dramatic difference in longevity. So this is my conclusion after all of this. First of all, I was very appreciative of my wife, and my kids have been there, and to essentially interact with the family. I feel we're part of the family and they're part of mine. And this is my conclusion. I'm not going to give you an answer. We have not arrived. When I was last in Bogalusa, one of the men said this about the future. We have not arrived. It's sort of a religious statement. We have not arrived in the promised land, but we also have not arrived in abolishing racial discrimination in health outcomes and health care. And the real question I pose to this group and the whole medical community and to others, how can we arrive and reduce these discrepancies? And that's it. Thanks very much. I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. That was probably the most profound talk we've had here in quite a while. I really thank you, Stanley. It's really great. Do you have any questions for Stanley?
Dr. Diller.
Dr. Rapoport, number one, congratulations on your personal career. You were headed into. It was thorough. The thing that concerns me the most is the statistics you just presented on maternal health and neonatal mortality. They're almost duplicated in the District of Columbia as we sit here. So the battle is by no means over, and we still have a long way to go.
That's right. I think the issue are pockets of poverty, bad education, healthcare are in the District of Columbia, Louisiana, West Virginia, and other areas in the major cities. And the real question I have is how can all these recommendations about future changes in health insurance and health care alone reverse these disparities? And that's a big question that I think we all have to face now. The past is but a part of the present, and it's still going on.
Any other questions? Stanley, it's been fabulous.
Thank you
you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stanley, for absolutely inspiring, great talk. That's all that we have on the agenda. If anyone has anything they want to bring up, do so now.
I didn't have a question, but I do have a statement. I both appreciate Dr. Rapoport's remarks tonight, but your colleagues at your table whose personal courage and commitment to this cause at a time when many young Americans don't understand the risks and dangers that everybody in the civil rights era faced. Everyone at your table, my hat's off to all of you, and I think everyone in this room. So, sir, thank you for your remarks, but for bringing your guests tonight and the work that they did for this cause, which we must not forget and we must not abandon today. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm George Dreesen, and I was down in Bogalusa in 1967, and I was asked to appear in the federal court, the federal district court there. It was adjudicating a motion to hold in contempt the people in Bogalusa who were fighting physically to prevent the kids from going to school under a desegregation order that had been issued by that court. The judge in that court was a man by the name of Hebe. He was an extraordinarily fine judge, and he received me with very great grace. And I made a speech before him about how nobody may defy the order of the United States District Court. That language, in turn, ended up in the Louisiana Times-Picayune, which is the only time I've ever been mentioned for anything I ever did as a lawyer, and appropriately so. But he was the real hero because his life was threatened to such an extent that subsequently he was appointed as a judge up here in the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia and the Federal Court of Appeals. But he was removed from the area because he was in danger. So there were lots of heroes scattered around in those days, of which Stanley is clearly one. And Judge Hebe, may he rest in peace, was another.
I'd like to make a final remark, was that I think that the work that Stanley did just had an amazing effect, not only in Bogalusa, but throughout this country. And oftentimes, when people are arguing cases, some of the lawyers have said to me that when they go to argue cases, they go back to Bogalusa, and they go back to that medical committee and their conclusions, and what they got back, what they recommended, and what the court ruled, and that they use that as a basis for making changes. And one of the things that is always important, I think, is that we can do, and is important, that we all find a way to make a change. But I think one of the most important things is that when we can implement policy, because once we implement policy, we get legal implementation. And once we get legal implementation, people can't change their mind about doing things. That it's a law. And the important things about anything that we're struggling in, be it child trafficking, be it civil rights, be it women's rights, be it gay rights, be it people of color, is that when we're able to change, get some policy and change the law, then we make real progress. Otherwise, people will say, okay, we'll do this, and after a while they say, well, I don't want to do this no more. But when we have the law, and when we fight for change through policy and the law, that makes a difference. And I also like to close by saying that we have always, many of us in the South, both blacks and whites, realized that if it had not been for people who came from the West, the Midwest, and the North and the East, that civil rights would never have gotten to where it is today. And we thank and appreciate everybody who realized that our struggle is everybody's struggle. Thank you.
The struggle for equality in health care and access to health care is a long struggle. One of the most prominent names in trying to relieve that inequity was Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who, among other things, was chair of anatomy at Howard University Hospital and president of the National Medical Association for a while, and many other things. He strived to insist that hospitals that received Hill-Burton funds could not discriminate. Ultimately, he won his goal. I don't know how many people realize that his son-in-law sits right over here, Dr. Robert Wilkinson.
Anyone else have something to say? Stanley, thank you very much. It's really profound that you could speak to us. Thanks very much.
And before everybody goes, make sure that you have put your initials on the sign-up sheet in the center of your table so we know who was here tonight as opposed to just who signed up. Also, anyone interested in running for office, there's some sign-up sheets on your table. Dr. Waddy is chair of the nominating committee. Get those to her. And Angela? Dr. Lazarus, I'm not sure everybody heard you. Were you asking people to turn their badges in? Everybody, be sure and drop your badges at the desk so we'll have them for the next meeting. And if there's nothing further, we have the room as long as people want to stay and talk. Thanks.